Montclair Media Alliance presents Scott Webb. What is Transmedia?
Transmedia is one of those words that gets used a lot, and I'm not sure even I know exactly, what the right definition of it is. It gets bandied around a lot, so I thought I could kind of unpack it a little bit with a little bit of my history. So just to back up a little bit, I guess, I started, as she said, at Nickelodeon. That was sort of one of my first big jobs. I was the first creative director there. And Nickelodeon was just a great experience for me because it was really the early days of cable TV. And, I'm sort of cut my teeth in cable TV. And cable TV has sort of come, and it's now we're seeing, I think, the dawn or the end of the cable TV era, and we're in a whole other, era now. So it was really informative because when I started cable TV, you'd think like, oh, this will never end, the wonderfulness of cable TV. So in those early days, I got to work with a great crew of people, and we came together to form a new kind of kids network. What would it mean to be a kids network? And what was interesting, my job at Nickelodeon in those days, I was a producer. I started off as a producer, but really my job when I got promoted to become a creative director was really about being in charge of Nickelodeon's identity and kind of understanding what's our relationship with our audience, what makes Nickelodeon what it is, and how do we be different from other things that are out there for kids. And we came up with sort of a set of informing ideas about what Nickelodeon was all about. And the core idea, and I could talk about that for a long time, but the core idea was this idea that it's tough to be a kid in a grown-up world. We looked at what was happening with kids. We looked at how we wanted to specifically kind of relate to kids. And we did a lot of research. We did a lot of talking to kids. And this idea of kind of it's tough to be a kid in a grown-up world, and we kind of expanded on that idea to this idea of kind of us versus them, that either you're for kids or you're an authority figure who's against kids. But we took that idea and we put everything that we had to do, regardless of what it was, sort of through this lens of what it meant to be a kid and how we wanted to uniquely relate to kids. So whether it was how we wanted to promote a show, or shows that we wanted to make, or shows that we would acquire, or promos that we would make, or contests that we wanted to have, everything went sort of through this rigor of how does it sort of connect to this idea of us versus them, where it's tough to be a kid in a grown-up world, and how can we be on kids' side. And what was interesting about this set of ideas is it didn't have anything to do with television. It had everything to do with the relationship that we wanted to build with kids. And so what was interesting for me as just a creative guy in this mix is as Nickelodeon became more successful, the business people wanted to expand Nickelodeon's business into other things like consumer products or location-based entertainment, or can we go international, or do we have a magazine, or can we go online? And they always came back to our little promotion department to say, how do we move into these other areas and stay true to these set of ideas that have made Nickelodeon successful, trusted by parents, loyal to kids, and continually sort of like new, fresh ideas that came out of these sort of core principles. And one of the things that we kind of created for ourselves, and I brought a copy tonight that I can put out and leave with you, but was this sort of manifesto. And the woman who ran Nickelodeon at the time, one of the great lessons that she gave me, I worked for her in several different capacities over the years, but she put Nickelodeon's identity in the form of a cause. That we were really there to make a difference in the world and trying to do something different. So it wasn't just about sort of a business mission, but it was about sort of a purpose that we had in being a champion for our audience. And it really always made the people who had to do jobs for Nickelodeon excited and passionate about whatever they wanted to do. So that Nickelodeon's brand identity had nothing to do with a particular platform, but it had everything to do with the kind of relationship that we wanted to build. And then there came a time when I moved from television, I moved into online, and I ran Nickelodeon's magazine, was that I realized in a speech that I had to give at one point that our job at Nickelodeon wasn't about getting kids to watch more television, but it was about how can we get them more involved in the Nickelodeon brand. And so maybe they would turn off the TV, but maybe they would go play with a Nickelodeon toy, or maybe they would go read a book about something else. You know, so it was really about a kind of involvement and an engagement that we wanted to have through that mission and that purpose that we had with our audience. And it was, you know, Transmedia didn't exist then, and cross-platform didn't exist then, but this idea that you could be thinking about a relationship with your audience in the form of a story or a cause or a purpose, and that could be used for whatever kind of platform might emerge, was a really intriguing idea. Especially as TV grew, it became a lot less interesting to me to work in television, and I moved over to running Nickelodeon Online, which felt like a whole new frontier because we were able to actually connect with kids and have them participate in things. And at one point, the company asked us to create a little laboratory that would keep us close to what was happening with kids. And the mission of this creative lab within Nickelodeon was to create new characters, stories, and formats, and to keep in the forefront of staying connected to kids and what they were up to. And I didn't know exactly what that meant, whether that was I was ingrained in television, and it was sort of, you know, do we just make more television in new and different ways? This is about taking more risks with different creative people. And I went and established a relationship with a company with the MIT Media Lab, which was a whole kind of eye-opening experience for me. I was saying to somebody earlier tonight that the MIT Media Lab actually came out of the architecture department within MIT, which is sort of interesting when you think about it, like why would those things go together? But they were really thinking about media architecture and really thinking of, so when I went to the MIT Media Lab, they were working with companies like Lego to develop whole new kinds of toy systems that were still based on the same basic experience of what it means to play with Legos, but they were adding computers into that. You know, they've got the Mindstorms product now and things like that, and give the kids the ability to create robots and things like that. But it was there that it kind of opened up my mind and my eyes that this idea of how brands and experiences really relate to, that the Nickelodeon brand was about a kind of an experience that we wanted the kids to have, and part of the job was in maintaining that and keeping that consistent and meaningful and always fresh. Like any relationship, you know, that you have with somebody who's important to you, you want to be both consistent and familiar, but you need to keep it fresh and exciting as well. And so one of the enemies of that within a big company like Nickelodeon or Viacom was that as they become more successful, they want to take less risks, they want to stay where the money comes from, and they really don't want to take a lot of risks about doing different sorts of things with their business, even if it means staying close to the audience. As I mentioned, I ran Nickelodeon Online in the really early days when the company thought there was no way anybody would ever make money with websites and online and things like that. And they really thought, like, you know, when that stuff, you know, happens, we'll buy our way into it. But they didn't see it as an important place for them to continue to kind of build and expand and build their relationship with their audience. And that's sort of when my kind of disillusionment with the company sort of began. But I was also really excited about thinking about developing and designing experiences that work across platforms. So I met somebody when I was working at the MIT Media Lab who was an experienced designer. And he and I formed a company years later called Static Free Media. That's what I do now. I work in Montclair, he's in Cambridge, and we collaborate virtually. But what we do is experience design for companies. And you've heard the term user experience, and that's only part of what we do. And user experience is if you've got an iPhone or anything else, how you navigate your iPhone and get to what you want. But an even bigger point of that is about kind of identity and kind of understanding relationship to what that core experience that a business or a creator wants to have. And we're in a really interesting time now when companies that have really valuable assets or experiences or properties or brands are the new market and world and digital space that we live in is changing and eroding everything that made their business secure in the past. So we were talking earlier with Julie about Scholastic. It's a company that has 50 years of delivering books to kids in a book club that parents and teachers trust, and yet the whole nature of publishing and books and everything else has changed. And in fact, it doesn't work the same way it does, and it's easier these days to, as Julie was saying, spend $5. You've got a child and you want to spend $5, go on Amazon and you've got it in your Kindle in seconds, really. And the whole old model that Scholastic spent 50 years getting great books to your kids that you knew were endorsed by your teachers has sort of all fallen apart. And that's just sort of one example within the kids space of how that is sort of falling apart. So we were hired by Scholastic at one point. They needed to redesign their website, and they knew it wasn't just about a new website design. They knew at their core that the world is changing. So what we work with in experience design is sort of getting back at that core identity of what makes a company, let's say like Scholastic, what's at the core of that value proposition that they have with kids, they have with parents, and they have with teachers, and can you articulate that and codify that for them so that then they can use that as a kind of a lens and a way to understand that relationship. So then they can use that as a map for, well, what should we be on the iPad, and what do we need to be doing, and how do we service customers on a website, or what should we be in the movies, or what should we be on television, and how do we want to extend our properties to maintain that relationship, and how do we get credit for it? There's other companies like that we work for too. Hasbro is a great experience, a company with 50 years making great toys and games that we all grew up with. But the whole nature of toys and games and play is being changed right now for our kids by digital media and how that works. And it's not like the nature of play has changed, but like nobody plays Scrabble the same way anymore. That experience has been taken by Words with Friends. Probably lots of us in here play Words with Friends. Somebody else understood that experience of playing great games with letters and words and finding, and having that experience with other people and playing that way, that's a great thing to do. Somebody figured out how to do that on the web and on your iPhone and on your iPad, and my wife spends hours a day on Words with Friends. So Hasbro lost one of its most valuable things, that Scrabble experience got taken by somebody else. Their G.I. Joe experience has sort of been taken by Call of Duty. Call of Duty sort of replaces what kids used to love playing with G.I. Joe with, what they got out of that. I think that that's happening all over the place in all kinds of ways. So I think that transmedia, transmedia is a term that was coined by a guy named Henry Jenkins, who's a brilliant guy, who thought about it in terms of storytelling first. Henry was one of the first people at MIT, and he's at USC now. But he recognized that fan culture made individual storytelling properties sort of bigger than what they are. So we saw that with Star Trek, which had only 2 seasons on television, but was kept alive for decades by fans who loved it and understood that there was a whole story world as part of Star Trek that people felt connected to, they felt a membership of, and they felt sort of an identity connection with Star Trek. And it was the fans who made that property continue to be valuable even while the show was not in production anymore, and it's a huge mega-billion-dollar franchise now. But Henry really recognized that there was a different kind of storytelling that was possible with kinds of stories like, that we see with a lot of sort of fantasy stories, but that there's a story world, and that there's a kind of storytelling that's possible where there's a author. George Lucas is the author of Star Wars, and that there's lots of ways into this story world that exists independent of any platform. So his first way to really convey and engage us in Star Wars was through the movies. But through that, there was a lot of licensing and of toys as another way into that story world, and books as a way to kind of continue that story world. And so that there's lots of different media platforms or doorways into this story world of Star Wars. And the movies are no longer just the one way in. Like most kids, there's probably billions, millions and millions of kids whose first experience into Star Wars now is through the toys as a way to understand that, and they'll find the movie other way. But it's about a consistent management of a story world that's authored and that provides sort of different ways for people to get into that story world. But it's a highly structured and organized way to do that. In contrast to something like Star Wars and the way that property got managed, you look at something like SpongeBob, which doesn't have one story world that all the parts are connecting to. It's a traditional sort of licensing and marketing model where you repeat and you repurpose in order to make as much money as possible. And it's another way to do it too, but it's, SpongeBob is not a transmedia kind of a property in that the different doorways, the different media platforms into the property don't integrate or relate to one another. If I play with a SpongeBob toy over here, it doesn't necessarily connect to some other part of the SpongeBob story world that I feel connected into one big thing. Henry Jenkins was a big proponent of this view of an authored story world with lots of ways into it, and I'm just sort of offering SpongeBob as a contrast to how that was done in the past. But this transmedia approach, as media grows and expands, is that approach is not just about storytelling anymore. It could have to do with brands like Scholastic or experiences like Scrabble. So transmedia is really sort of an approach. It's a way to think about a design and an experience and a relationship that you want to have with your audience. And it can be applied in lots of different ways. And again, I'm sort of curious what all of you do and your interest in how different media platforms relate to one another and what sort of brought you here. I think that creative people need to think differently these days about sort of what that experience is. It's not just about migrating an old print experience into a new platform. I think it's really thinking about experience design and the relationship that you want to achieve and how that might be part of a business result that you want to have and what success might be. I think that that's sort of the last thing, the last big lesson that I got, and sort of the little journey that I've been on personally is that, in the early days when I was working within Nickelodeon and other companies that I've worked with, and you start to think that the success is all about money. One of the great lessons I got was that success really comes sort of in three flavors. I think that people want to be loved, they want to be rich, and they want to be famous. And I think that different media platforms and different activities that you may be involved in, I think are not always just about generating revenue, but they may be about fame or awareness. They may be about love or loyalty, or they may be about transactional, and that you want to, get people to cough up money for whatever you're doing. But I think that idea of success being more dimensional sort of goes with the idea of our media landscape and world also sort of being more dimensional too. So that's sort of like, I don't know if that's a great explanation of transmedia, but that's kind of my experience of the journey that I've been on.
Thank you for listening to this Montclair Media Alliance presentation.